Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Journalism, like anything else, is subject to change. And over the last decade, it has undergone tremendous changes, the sort that have impacted nearly every aspect of journalism. The size of newsrooms, sources of revenue, changes in ownership, and the means of making and getting content to the public. Brant Houston has been an active contributor to journalism's transformations, both as professor and Knight Chair in Investigative and Enterprise Reporting at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and as the co-founder of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. His new book, Changing Models for Journalism, Reinventing the Newsroom, explores those transformations in depth, and he joins us now to talk about it. Brant, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now let's get right to it. Is journalism in decline, and is that even the right question to be asking?
First of all, journalism is not in decline. What is in decline is what we term the mainstream legacy media that we relied on for so long. What's on the upswing is the nonprofit newsroom model and a lot of innovative digital newsrooms.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get to those two pieces of the upswing, you talked about legacy institutions. Let's talk about traditional news. When would you pinpoint the start of the decline of the traditional news model?
In the research in my book, actually, I would say more like 1979, 1980, when people were consultants were raising the alarm about the amount of penetration of newspaper news among the public. In other words, the number of people who were actually reading the news was going down. But the real decline we all noticed really hit with the Great Recession, and that's when even more layoffs occurred in mainstream newspapers and other media.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about 2007, 2008, thereabouts.
Yes.
And before we leave the point of when the decline of traditional news started, you mentioned 79, 80. What was it that was behind that decline?
Well, the beginning was TV. The TV was cutting into it. And as new technology came along, it cut more and more into the traditional newspapers in that model. And that's when the harvesters, also known as predators or vultures, started showing up and selling off assets and cutting staff to keep the profits going up.
And I think it's an important thing to sort of think about in the context of what kinds of changes have happened over time. Now, one of the ways that print original news outlets, which were competing with television and then with the advent of the internet, obviously things that were online, there was competition, and news outlets were making up for losses in print edition subscriptions and sales with the use of paywalls for digital access. And many people, based on how they've reacted to that, they don't want to pay for content anymore. And they're upset when they can't access content for free. So there is maybe a bit of entitlement there. So if we take it back to the time that you were talking about, 2007, 2008, and the Great Recession, at that time there were news sites offering free content in early internet days, we could say.
Yes.
Did that do some unintended damage around setting people's expectations for what they should get without paying for it?
Yes, it did a lot of damage. It also gave the content a way to Google, Yahoo, and others who've made enormous money using that content as a way to attract advertisers. So it was a big error. We did not embrace the new technology the way we should have.
Okay. So as far as embracing new technology, who has done that well? So what sort of business models in journalism are doing well, and is it that they're leveraging?
Well, one thing is to realize that you're digital. That's a big thing. And the second thing is to realize that people are reading news off their mobile phones. So you start to think in a different way. You start to think in streams of news. But if you're looking at somebody who's combining the different models really well, there could be Block Club Chicago, which is doing incredible neighborhood coverage, or Outlier Media in Detroit, which is based on texting to people who don't have broadband internet. So those are the kind of innovations where you're getting more community engagement in the old ways of face-to-face, even through the pandemic, and you're getting it through texting. And innovation is a lot of times combining different technologies.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk with us more about Block Club Chicago? It is a nonprofit, but there is also a subscription base involved there?
Yeah, most of their content is free and out there. Their basic content. The subscriptions are set up as a way of supporting them. I consider mine a donation. In full disclosure, I'm on their board. Mm-hmm. And then special information or newsletters. But the bulk of their information is available. And they kind of took up the magic monthly number that a lot of places have, which was in the last year. It seems like people are very willing to spend about $5 a month without thinking too hard about it, mm-hmm. whether it's Substack, Block Club Chicago, an Apple service. But that's part of the model they have, and they're raising money and they're having events. They've set up numerous revenue streams.
Mm-hmm. And as for for-profit outlets, which ones do utilize a paywall or subscription service well?
It's the big guys for the most part. New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal has the added bonus of being really concentrated on a topic, and that's where subscriptions really work out. Mm-hmm. And Bloomberg, it's the big ones that seem to have the most success. Where our failures and problems have been is in metro and local coverage. Mm. And even if somebody's for profit, you can tell now they're asking for donations. The Seattle Times, I think, has more than 24 reporters that are supported by donations funneled through the Seattle Foundation.
Mm-hmm. So is that an example of for-profit taking lessons from the nonprofit?
Lessons. It's also desperation.
Sure.
I mean, when your model blows up, which it was advertising, you really have to scramble to replace those revenues the best you can. Mm-hmm. So, I like the Salt Lake Tribune. It was honest about its situation. It went from for-profit to nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And just acknowledged that's what's keeping people alive. And people question the nonprofit model, but look who I'm talking to. Public broadcasting. It's been going on for decades.
Right. Well, and before we drop this point about these bigger outlets that are succeeding, what do you think it would take for smaller outlets, local ones? You just talked about what's going on in Salt Lake City. What do smaller local outlets need to do to get the same results that the big guys do?
Well, fortunately, they don't have to get those results, thank goodness, that amount of revenue. But I think what we're seeing in the local area, Block Club Chicago is doing it on a larger scale, but you get donors or subscribers for a minimum amount. You get sponsorships when you can. You hold events. Some of that is taken from what small weeklies are doing to continue. Mm-hmm. The one thing that people forget is the overhead costs have gone way down if you don't have to print something and deliver it. So that's helped us a lot on the cost side.
Mm-hmm. But isn't there something that is lost when we lose print, or is that an outmoded way of thinking, or maybe just a way of resisting what is already here?
Well, it's sad to say I started out with print and newspapers, but print in terms of news, except for special editions and things, and on a daily basis, it's over. And my students have not read newspapers routinely for years. They do read news. They read news that comes out of newsrooms, in addition to social media. But I think at some point we have to go. It's over, not completely gone, but it's over.
And where is it that your students get their content? What do you hear from them about where they want to work?
Well, some still want to work in traditional broadcast, which is not gone down as quickly as the rest. There's some that want to work in newsrooms that may produce a newspaper. They tend to look at newsletters, topic-driven newsrooms. So it's all over the place, but what they're realizing is that looking at nonprofit newsroom is reasonable, very reasonable. I mean, in the midst of the tremendous cuts we've had in mainstream and legacy media, the number of independent nonprofit newsrooms who have been vetted by the Institute for Nonprofit News has grown from about 25 in 2009 to more than 450 now. So there's a lot of opportunity and different sizes and missions in the nonprofit newsroom network.
Right. Well, and we are, as you said, we are in the midst of a fundraising drive here at St. Louis Public Radio because we are a nonprofit outlet. And part of what we are doing is collaborating and sharing content with many other organizations in the region. How does the nonprofit model change the way newsrooms see their relationships with one another, specifically from competitors to collaborators, just in about 30 seconds?
Yeah, so we had one big C before, which is competition. We now have collaboration and coordination. And that's how the model has changed. When you need to collaborate and coordinate your collaboration in order to get all the news out you need to get out there.
And is public media something that your students say they're interested in getting to?
Yes.
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 So we're going to take a very quick break here.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Now back to our conversation with Brant Houston. He's professor and Knight Chair in Investigative and Enterprise Reporting at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His new book, Changing Models for Journalism, Reinventing the Newsroom, comes out of his experiences as a journalist, an educator, and the co-founder of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, an association of more than 240 investigative journalism nonprofits throughout the world. Now, Brant, before the break, we were talking about collaboration, producing content. You had noted that nonprofit news organizations are doing well. But as we think about funding for them and resources, is there some danger of oversaturation with nonprofit news organizations, particularly given competition for funding?
I don't think so, not yet. There are so many news deserts and what we call ghost newspapers throughout the United States. There's more than enough news to go around, and I think enough funding to go around for it because, once you don't have it, you really appreciate it, and you're more willing to support your local news in some way, whether it's donations or through memberships like public broadcasting. Mm-hmm. I think we'll see increased funding not only from local institutions and businesses, but from people. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we're at the saturation point because we're missing so much.
Right. Now, as far as the kinds of content that's being produced, your roots are in investigative journalism. How is it that that form of journalism is faring across the board?
I think it's really overall doing well, and primarily because the nonprofit newsrooms have initially started because so many investigative reporters were either laid off or frustrated wherever they were working. And so they've been able to focus more on the investigations and daily, weekly accountability reporting than they had been for years.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think that says about people's, appetite for that kind of journalism?
Well, I think no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you do want your government watchdogged. You want to know what it's up to. You want to know how it's spending your money. So I think, the response to accountability in reporting, not just big projects, investigative reporting is really good.
Mm-hmm. So as far as ownership, that is something that has been a big part of the conversation. And private equity firms, which often swoop in on businesses in distress, have been buying out newspapers for some time. The share of American newspapers owned by private equity groups increased from 5% to 23% between 2001 and 2019. Now, for those who follow what happens with newspapers closely, the answer to this question coming up may be obvious, but for others, how does this trend show itself in the content we do or don't see?
Well, the hedge funds or, new investors come in. They're coming in basically to harvest, in business terms, in a distressed industry. That means you'll see them sell the real estate. You won't see a newspaper office. They'll lay off staff. You'll see the manifestation of it, and that your paper gets thinner and thinner, and then it gets delivered on every other day or once or twice a week. And the business plan is for this to disappear after what last profits can be reaped from it are taken.
Mm-hmm. And how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect this trend?
Well, it definitely affected the trend in more papers closing or being absorbed into chains that tend to aggregate what content they have to keep ad revenues coming in.
Mm-hmm. And what danger does that pose to the public having the information that it needs?
It's terrible. I live in a community that the newspaper is trying to survive, but it's taking a lot of hits. There are agencies that haven't been covered routinely in years.
Mm-hmm.
There's budgets passed that no one gets to know about. And one of the more serious things is you start to lose a forum for civil discussion, mm-hmm. which, of course, undermines the deep elements of democracy.
Yeah. Well, what are some examples of news outlets, Brant, that are doing well at connecting with communities and also with finding new audiences?
Well, I've cited a couple of them earlier. They're Block Club Chicago, which is covering Chicago neighborhoods that haven't really been covered in years and building up new audiences through community events, getting out into the neighborhoods. Their reporters, for the most part, are embedded in the neighborhoods they cover. Mm-hmm. Outlier Media in Detroit is using texting. That builds up new audiences in terms of city services and problems. Wisconsin Watch has become the leading aggregator, collator, and originator of state news, mm-hmm. and providing state news and working with public broadcasting.
Yeah.
So those are some places where the audiences are building up. People are finding places where they can get very credible, evidence-based news, and that's the way you really build audiences. And you cover neighborhoods and people who haven't gotten any coverage, like I said, for decades.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about social media, because this is how people they do share good journalism. Then you have platforms like TikTok and Instagram, and these are being leveraged as ways to reach new audiences. Is it the case, however, that people are really clicking into news stories from these apps, or do they just continue to scroll through? And then, how is it that outlets are supposed to make any money from something like TikTok?
Well, that's a really good question. I am concerned that we may be repeating errors of the past and giving away things for free to people who are aggregators and making money off of it. So, what you want to do is have people point to your news stream or your news site, and that's going to be a real issue in how you actually get money out of that. Mm-hmm. I think if you have credible news and you build your audience and they're used to coming to you not for lots and lots of opinion, but for what's actually going on, mm-hmm. That's your best bet.
Yeah. Now, Brant, so far we've been mostly talking about business model of journalism, but it's also worthwhile to note the culture clashes and ethical dilemmas that cyber environments create and present challenges to an outlet's ability to maintain credibility and trust. So, given what the environment is, what do you make of that cultural piece and the ethical piece as well?
Well, again, I tend to push to go to fundamentals in the midst of what some people consider quite a chaos of information and disinformation. I think you have to establish yourself as a relatively calm and reliable voice in the middle of all this. And the culture clashes are going to continue. They're amplified by social media. But I do see a trend towards people saying, we're just giving you the basic news, go elsewhere to have your clashes and share your opinions. But it's a challenge.
Yeah. So it's some decision-making about which kinds of information to put out or content and whatnot. Earlier you talked about investigative journalism doing well, and that's not typically something that we associate with, happy stories. And then there's this notion of news fatigue, which is the idea that a lot of the news is really tough to hear, and that people want, quote unquote, good news. And we've heard as much when we've surveyed our listeners a year and a half ago. So in general, they've said that they want more happy stories or more joy. What do you make of that, Brant?
I think, apart from, say, a newsroom that is into accountability reporting, you do want to have a mix, and you don't want to be a relentless parade of problems. There has been a movement called solutions journalism that really pushes, if you are presenting a problem, making sure to include what solutions other people have come up with. Mm-hmm. But I started out a community newspaper, and personally as a reporter, I periodically wanted to do the feature and the happier story, along with the story that told you how your public money might be misspent or employees weren't showing up to work or things like that. Yeah. So I think people want to mix, but I think if you gave them all happy news, then they would say, well, why aren't you telling me about city council or the zoning board and why they did this, or why the utilities just hiked our rates by 50%?
Right. Well, clearly
so I think when you poll them, they'll say, yes, I want happy news, but they also want this other stuff.
Right. Brant Houston is professor and Knight Chair in Investigative and Enterprise Reporting at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's also the co-founder of the Global Investigative Journalism Network and author of Changing Models of Journalism, Reinventing the Newsroom. Brant, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury, with audio engineering by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.